Thank you. If I can have the... So this is a short presentation on educating for sustainable development and climate change. And I will recall a sequence of events on the last 2 years. First, in this room, April 2 years ago, we had a joint workshop, Sustainable Humanity, Sustainable Nature. And this workshop addressed about every issue, climate, biodiversity, water, etc. But it stopped short of dealing with education. And everybody agreed at that time that this was such an important question for the practical implementation of sustainable development in all the world that it had to be addressed. So, but the next step was the encyclical letter of the Pope. And this letter obviously made very strong points. First, science is recognized and research supported as fundamental importance to give the facts of the reality. Second, justice is at stake because we have to hear the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor. And finally, in chapter 6 of the encyclical, education was a focus under the title Education and Ecological Spirituality, which was connecting education, a tool to understand the world and to describe it and to act on it, and a conversion of the heart. Then the scene was set for a second workshop of the Academy, which we had a year ago, Children and Sustainable Development, which examined how education should move. And this is going to be published probably next week. It's a book, it will be also online, and we examine a number of issues related to education and sustainable development involving the brain of the child, teachers, systematic organization of education, and we also listen to the voice of children. This was an interesting experience to have in this room about 20 children from 12 nations speaking on their view of existing education and the way it should evolve. So it was agreed that since science is at the source of all the observation of the situation of today's development, it should also be science education who should take care of preparing the next generation. This is a huge task if one thinks that 30% of the world population is youngsters. They are youngsters and children. 1 billion children do not have proper education. 150 million do not have education at all. So, since science education is the focus, how to cultivate a critical mind and a mind able to be creative and doubtful in the K-12 education. But also, and the encyclical recalls that values are involved, justice, intergenerational responsibility, and solidarity. And this has also been part of a global understanding of sustainable development among children. So, as our colleague Ramanathan says, not only a critical mind, but also a hopeful heart. Now, there is a historical interesting example for such a big change. It's the increase of life expectancy in France. Between 1850 and 1950, the life expectancy increased from 40 years to 60 years, 50%, huge increase. And this was largely due to hygiene and education. The introduction of compulsory primary education, the role of hygiene being explained to teachers and then to students, produced a huge change in the society, which was partly based on scientific results, of course, Louis Pasteur, and partly based on the way education was able to transfer this concern. Now, do we need education on sustainable development. This slide was projected by Wagner last year on the workshop, and you see the studies, this is 2015, so this is recent, 3 questions asked in various continents, and it's the median, which is reported below. Climate change is a very serious problem, 54%. Of positive answer. Climate change is harming people now, 51%. And the last one, very concerned that climate change will harm me personally, 40%, and even less in Europe or in the US. So really there is a huge gap between the perception of the importance of the matter we discuss here today and the reality. And this is the role of education, especially for the young generation who will be involved in the next 20 or 30 years. And of course they have access to information, but the problem is not to give more information, it's to structure it, to change the mindset. As Einstein was saying, you have to change the mindset if you want to solve the problem that the former mindset has created. And the structuring of the information is really the task of school. This is difficult to do because one has to do it quickly. There is an urgency because climate change doesn't wait. This has to be done in a terribly unequal access to school. The report published in September by UNESCO, a very interesting report, Education for People and Planet, shows that the forecast today is that by 2050, for the less wealthy or the more poor part of the population of the Earth, only 60% of the kids will have access to middle school. So this is really the cry of the poor. And we have to do it with unprepared teachers. This is not the least task. For example, interdisciplinarity, which is a characteristic of all these issues related to sustainable development, is far from being practiced in schools today. As the Laudato Si says, calling no form of wisdom can be left aside. So interdisciplinarity is the first step into mixing the forms of scientific wisdom. Now, I just have time to show one example of the step that education system have to do to deal with the ideas which are involved in the science of the subject. I make a short list of those. Earth as a system and interdependencies, multifactorial causes, while students are used to one cause, one effect, feedbacks, which is in linear or even worse, in nonlinear factors, unusual scales of space of time, thinking of an action which has an impact 3, 4, 5 decades ahead of time. The difference between stock and flux and the orders of magnitude of those flux exchange on the Earth. Then a very important and difficult question is to understand what is modeling, climate models, for instance. What is a projection in the future, and what means a probability of a projection in the future. All those are issues which and then even more difficult, and that's probably to be kept for higher education and not for primary or secondary, but the characteristic of nonlinear systems which have phase transition, instabilities, and tipping points. So this is a short list which could be developed in curricula and in teacher education and in modules for the class. It's a long task ahead to transfer the existing system. Now, what about the perspective of implementing this? And I'll make a few brief comments. In December last year, we had the Paris Agreement, and there is an important article which says parties take measures to improve education on climate change. And this is a commitment signed by the signatories of the treaty. This month, we had the COP22 in Marrakesh, and then there was the announcement of the next IPCC reports. There will be one intermediate report in 2018 on the achievement of the 1.5 degree C perspective, and then two main reports on land and oceans and ice the year after, and the final and global report number 6 in 2022-23. So among the various ideas to modify education, one is emerging, which I think is interesting. Reports are regularly translated, quotes, for political and economical audiences. This is the work of Group 3 of IPCC. So a question, how to translate these reports towards educational systems, to teachers, to families, to transform the raw information which the press is conveying and the scientific information which is in the report and very solid to a tool which could transform education. And this has to be done not only for developing countries, but also for developed countries, because they were the one which in the previous slide were showing the less concern about personal impact of changes. So there are many possibilities to do that, and if I gave the title of the role of science academies, because it's possible that science academies may play a very fundamental role in this capacity to change the mindset of scientific education. And I can see very encouraging proof of that. In the last 2 decades, this is the list of scientists, including Mario Molina, who is here, and the 2 other Nobel Prizes, plus a number of other scientists, who have in their country, in their region, or on a global scale, play a great role in changing science education, in transforming science education from where it is simply repeating, learning by heart without understanding, to an inquiry process where it's not so much the information which matters, but the process of thinking, of doubting, of being critical, the very process of science. And this can begin in kindergarten and grow up progressively. So I think this is why I conclude saying that the scientists in general and the academies specifically have a great role to play in the future in transforming sustainable development education. Thank you.